It's Phil's Pop Culture Podcast.
Watching television.
A dynamite place to be.
Dynamite!
Sponsored by Vandelay Industries, importers and exporters of fine latex products since 1992. And now, the man who taught Frank Burns how to eat worms, here's your host, Phil Kahn.
And thank you, John Meany, wherever you are. I am indeed Phil Kahn, and I welcome you to the latest edition of Phil's Pop Culture Podcast. Today's guest is a longtime friend and fellow native of Saratoga Springs, New York, writer Joseph Cutshall-King. Author of several books, including the highly acclaimed mystery novel, The Burning of the Piping Rock, I recently had a chance to chat with my friend about the beginnings of his writing career, his numerous books, and his recollections of growing up in the Spa City. Let's take a listen to my fun and fascinating conversation with Joe. Hi, Joe. So glad a fellow Saratogian is on the program. And by the way, I'm hoping you have a story or two ready to share with the listeners about Saratoga. But first, I want to talk about you and how your writing career got started. But anyway, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks for having me on. This is great. And it's always great to be sharing thoughts with a fellow Saratogian, a lover of half-born water.
Yes, sirree. So how did it all get started, your writing career?
I wrote when I was in college, but only papers. I never wrote a thing. And I came to Glens Falls in 1975 to be the director of the Chapman Historical Museum. And when they hired me, they said, as part of it, you will have to write a column for the Post-Star, and a weekly column. And I said, oh my God, I can't do that. And they said, well, then you don't get the job. I said, you know what? I can do that.
Yes, how quickly things change.
To expand that a little further, There was a woman named Susan Buffington who was running the Bicentennial Committee, and Sue was really, I think, had set this up. She was doing actually every other week, so I had every other week to do. At the end of a month, Sue said, I am absolutely so overloaded. She said, I just can't do it. So I said, oh, okay. So I went to the Post-Star and I said, you know what? Sue Buffington can't write it every other week, but I'll continue to do mine every other week. And they said, no, you have to do it weekly. I said, I can't do that. They said, well, if you don't do it weekly, we'll pull the column. I said, I can do that. And so for almost 10 years, I wrote a weekly column.
It's amazing what we figure out what we can do when we didn't think we could do it. And I guess the fact that they held the job over your head was quite the motivator, huh?
It certainly was. My parents brought me up with this nasty habit of wanting to eat. And so as an adult, the only way I was going to achieve that was by going to the grocery store and paying with money. So there you go.
Indeed. Well, speaking of the Post-Star, which is a Glens Falls daily newspaper, you returned in 1994 and wrote a weekly column. And as a matter of fact, I just picked up a copy of your latest book, as you know, and I know you know that because you actually signed the copy for me. It's called
Thank you.
Over My Shoulder, a collection of Over My Shoulder and Past Times columns published in the Post-Star from 1994 to 2003, Volume 1, 1994 to 1997. Boy, that's a mouthful.
I know. How about we just say Over My Shoulder and we'll let it go with that?
Perfect. Tell me more about the book, Joe.
Well, I have been really fortunate in having people ask me for old copies of a particular column. I'd say, gee, I really like this, and could I get a copy of that? And enough people began to ask me for it and said they missed the column, which was very gratifying. And just one day I was talking with my wife and my daughter, and I said, gee, I wonder, maybe I should just try to do a book of it. So I got all the columns out, and I looked at it, and I had written 403 of them.
Oh, my God.
There was like 80. Oh, yeah, I know. Tens of thousands of words. And so I asked my daughter to be the editor to go through and essentially pick out the ones that were dated, boring, and then give me her thoughts about how to best present it what are people going to sit down and look at? And, so she came up with the idea of doing Glens Falls, then regional history, and then personal reminiscences. And that's really what the columns were about, Phil. They were regional history that covered from, Ticonderoga to Saratoga, over into western Vermont, and pretty deeply into the Adirondacks. And I had 10 years, almost 10 years worth of good times writing that. Put my Saratoga memories in there, too. So I had a lot of those, and every place that we lived, which, we actually lived Saratoga, Fort Edward, Ticonderoga, then I lived in Glens Falls, and I just wrote like a madman, and it was definitely going to be, we had to stop. We had to stop at 4 years, otherwise the book would have been like a telephone book for Manhattan.
Plus, if you tasked your daughter Julia with picking out the boring and rotten ones, what does that account for? 1 or 2 or 3 of the hundreds and hundreds that you wrote?
Oh, you're very kind. Well, you have ones that are dated, of course, like, the casino is going to have this event, Jamie Perillo is going to be out there, shooting fireworks or something like that. And then again, you just said, well, you can't read a 20-something-year-old announcement for an event that's 20-something years old.
Right.
So out those went. And then there were some that we had vigorous conversations, and but she was right. My daughter's in her 30s. It gives a fresh perspective, and there were a few times when I was clutching to my babies, and she'd say, Dad, and I get that, Dad. One of them I wouldn't let go of, and she said, Dad, it's boring. And and when you ask somebody to be your editor, you really kind of have to. A couple I fought to keep in, and one was about I joined a group trying to save a house from being destroyed in Glens Falls, and it didn't happen. And I wanted the reader to know that I was kind of Don Quixote, and I lost that one. That windmill left town.
So not everything you touched turned to gold, huh?
No. I'm kind of wondering if maybe I should have stayed out of it. Maybe they would have left the house up, right?
Right. That's what I'm thinking. No, but seriously, I like the breadth of the columns that appeared over the years. Everything from Burgoyne's campaign to abolition to women's suffrage, the history of tourism in Lake George, the founding of LARAC, skiing in Bolton, to your childhood recollections, et cetera, et cetera. And, we could certainly spend several hours talking about all of those topics. But off the top of the show, I said, Joe, I want you to share with me at least 1 or 2 memories of Saratoga Springs, since we both grew up there. So hit me with what you got. All
right. Well, I always say I was born on Lincoln Avenue. I wasn't. I was born in the Saratoga Hospital. And actually, I have a memory about my birth, not my birth, my sister's birth in Saratoga Hospital. Martha was born there.
Yeah.
We lived down the street on Lincoln Avenue from Frank Sullivan, who I'm sure many of your listeners will remember as a fabulous humorist, member of the Round Table, and a guy who wrote for The New Yorker. He wrote humorous columns for decades. And Frank was a wonderful neighbor, a great man. And he loved our family, and we loved him. And when Martha was born in 1950, January of 50, he and Monty Woolley, with whom he was fast friends, came over. It was January. They came over and said to my father in the hospital, have you eaten at all? Have you done anything? My father hadn't. He'd just been there. They said, come on, let Jane sleep, and we'll take you out to dinner. So they took him down to the Colonial, which was on Broadway and was Frank's favorite watering hole. And so there they were, and they filled my father up on steak and all other kinds of things. Well, both Frank and Monty were prodigious drinkers. They were veterans at this. Yeah. And my father was no slouch. He had come out of World War II and could really bend an elbow on a Manhattan. But these two men, they absolutely put him under the table. They got him fed, properly watered, as it were, took him out to a cab, drove him home to our house on Lincoln Avenue,
Yeah.
got them into bed, tucked them in, and then they went out and really got down to some serious drinking for the evening. And later that year, it was neat because Frank wrote his annual Christmas poem for the New Yorker, and he included my sister.
No kidding.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, it's such nice memories. The Kaplans lived next door to us, Cy and Vicky. And I always mispronounce Vicky's name as Vichy. And,
like the Vichy water that was so
like
popular?
Vichy water, right. And we'd hang out down at the Five Points, one of my favorite stores. I'm so glad the Five Points is still going.
I know, me too. Okay, you got to have another anecdote in you. That was a great one. I love it.
Okay, great. Oh, gosh, let's see. Dad ran Mac Finn's, which was a pharmacy that was downtown. Saratogians would remember Mac Finn's maybe that was up on Lake. But this was the original that was down on Broadway and 396. It burned in the fire of 57. Mm-hmm. But when we were there, Dad ran it from 1946 to 1952. Saratoga during the season was, it was just on fire. You know, you had the track, you had all the illegal casinos going, and those who came into to Mac Finn's, to the pharmacy.
Yeah.
And so you had really just anybody who was anybody who sang, those who were singing up at the casinos, Bing Crosby, Kay Williams, the Williams brothers, you know, later Andy became one of them. He lived up on Lincoln Avenue during the summer.
Oh. So
they would come in. Yeah. And one of the guys who came in is somebody, I don't know if you're old enough to remember, there was a cigarette, Philip Morris, and there was a bellboy who was Philip Morris Johnny, and he would come in, he always did an ad, call for Philip Morris, and he would come into the pharmacy, and people would stop. I mean, he was that big a deal, and nothing would do, but he would stop, shout out, call for Philip Morris. And one day my brother was in there, and Johnny came over, wrapped an arm around him, and did that. And my brother was a little boy at the time. He was born in 1943, so maybe he was like 7 or 8 at the time. My brother said, I loved him. He was the only grown-up who was my size.
That is great. And you know, you've provided me with a wonderful segue. It's as if we spoke ahead of time about what we'd be talking about. You mentioned the word fire. You mentioned the casinos and the gambling that was going on. What a nice segue into one of the novels that you wrote. Actually, your first fiction novel called The Burning of the Piping Rock. I absolutely loved it. Can you tell the listeners more about this truly intriguing and exciting book?
Oh, sure. The plot of it is based upon the actual arson, as yet unsolved, of Piping Rock Casino, which was a mob-controlled casino that was on Gilbert Road in Saratoga. Mm-hmm. And at that point, today the only thing that's left of Piping Rock, there is a Piping Rock Road. If you go just as you turn off Union onto Gilbert. So Piping Rock was there. It was had been there from the 1920s on. Mm-hmm. And after the U.S. Senate came in and absolutely demolished gambling in Saratoga, all these illegal casinos that the mob ran were destroyed, and usually by fire. As the Saratogian used to say, they, quote, mysteriously burned, unquote. They used that phrase so many times that they probably had in the old days of the typesetting, they probably had that block just sitting out there so they could slam it in. And my father, running Mac Finn's, was deeply involved. His boss, Jim Larry, was the head of the Republican machine, and the Republican machine, along with the Democratic machine, served the mob. And it didn't get done if the Democrats and Republicans, their machines weren't there to help them out. Mm-hmm. And so Dad got involved with it up to his eyeballs, and we hurriedly left Saratoga after his boss had been indicted in 1952 by the state of New York for gambling and all sorts of other things. He was a bad boy. Aww. And we ended up in Fort Edward.
Banished to Fort Edward, New York. Oh, gosh.
I know. We ran so far. And, and one day Dad turned to me, and as I say, he'd been a pharmacist who had managed the place. He just looked at me, and he had been complaining about Larry and saying how much he had been cheated by him. And he looked at me and he said, I sold the Scotch tape and cellophane to the Torch, who burned down the Piping Rock, and the Torch meaning the arsonist. Yeah. And I was, I think, 11 at the time, and I said, my heavens, what do you say to that? And he told me a little bit more about why the cellophane wrapping paper and Scotch tape were used, because they left no trace,
right.
Tape them up to wood and, cellulose on cellulose. Well, he just clammed up after that, and I never knew anything more. And he went to his grave without ever having told me how it was that he was involved.
Oh.
And it bugged me. He died in 1987, and one day I thought, I've got to solve the story. I tried to write it as a history, but there wasn't any solution. So hence the novel. And I wrote it on the basis of his taping his remembrances just before he died, and narrating the story of how he and Harry the Torch drove down from Fort Edward to Saratoga to burn the Piping Rock. And I'm not going to say anything more about that, because if I do, then nobody will want to read the end of it.
But I like the way you framed it, and I don't want to give too much of it away, but in the novel, and I don't know if this is true or not, apparently you come across a taped confession of events from that night, August 16th, 1954, from your dad, and it's kind of like a dying man's confession, and you hear the tapes and you find out all about your dad's evening of... what word do I want to use?
Weenie roasting, as he says in the novel.
Yes, weenie roasting with Harry the Torch. And boy, that was a really fun way to set up the story. Now, the Piping Rock was actually run by some heavy hitter mafia members: Joe Adonis, Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky. Tell me more about that whole scene. And you had mentioned earlier, I believe it was Estes Kefauver that jumped in and kind of cleaned everything up in town.
Yeah, at the end of World War II, after the Depression ended and the war ended, they went back to the old days of the 20s, and of course now liquor was legal, so these casinos came back in big time, and they were all locally owned through these shell corporations, and three mobsters who had come up in the 19-teens to run gambling establishments up in Saratoga, Costello and two others, just were there running every show. In fact, most of the casinos were under their guidance, shall we say, and these casinos made major money. Phil, there wasn't anything that was small town about it. Mm-hmm. They were big town casinos running, games that would yield millions in a week, millions in a day and age when you could buy a fully tricked out Cadillac or Mercedes Benz for $1,000. Mm-hmm. You had somebody like Walter Chrysler, true story, who went into the Piping Rock Casino in 1948, got into a crap game, lost $400,000, got up, brushed off the dirt from his nicely pressed suit and said, "Gentlemen, that will be an evening," and left. Wow. And 2 nights later he came back and won $600,000. So a net profit of a mere $200,000, which translate that today, $6 or $8 million. Take $200,000 in buying power then and translate it to 2018, and you got some real money.
Absolutely.
So I angered a lot of people when I published the novel. I don't know if I ever mentioned that.
No.
I named names, which were real.
Ooh.
Some people didn't. They didn't care, they were very lovely about it. The Ahern family, for example, the Sheriff Ahern was mentioned in the novel, Chief of Police Rocks, and others who had been subpoenaed by Senator Kefauver. They were mentioned in the novel. They were there. That was historic fact. Yeah. And but other people who sort of gasped and thought that perhaps I was shedding a bad light on Saratoga, and I said, "My God, what planet do you live on?" Mm-hmm. They weren't running the Howdy Doody show there. They were gambling, and it was illegal.
Sure.
And they also did break legs, and they also murdered people. And if you drive out Route 29, there's an old man who lives over in Salem, New York, and he told me he doesn't pass by that walking area out Route 29, just past the intersection of Gilbert and 29, without thinking about the number of bodies that there are in there.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, carefully cemented from the knees down.
Right.
Yeah, it was a tough place. There was a lot of veneer of civilization because the casinos were funded to a great extent also by Manhattan and Long Island money.
Sure.
The rich.
The Gold Coast, right?
The Gold Coast of Long Island. They came up from having run their ponies at their various clubs and polo centers, and they said, we want up here what we have down there.
Sure.
So you had polo clubs and you had entertainment. The entertainment at the Piping Rock, Phil, was just right off of Broadway. Nate Prosser's reviews were the creme de la creme.
Indeed, that's what I've heard. Well, if the folks listening have not read the book, I highly recommend it. And at the end of the program, we'll be able to tell people where they can get the book, where they can find more information about you. But we'll save that for a little bit. We want to continue to whet their appetites. But what a wonderful novel that was.
Thank you so much. It was fun writing it.
I bet. It was fun reading it.
Yeah. Now,
you've also published several full-length histories, one of which I'd like to focus on, and that's called Water and Light, S.R. Stoddard's Lake George. Why don't you fill the folks in on that particular book, which I found fascinating as well?
For 10 years, I was the director of the Chapman Historical Museum in Glens Falls, which has a wonderful Stoddard collection. Stoddard was a 19th century American photographer who was born in Wilton. I have to say that because he was a Saratoga guy, and Saratoga County. But he rose to the ranks of being a stupendous photographer and well respected and loved in his own time, whose works really, although he photographed all over the United States and into Europe, he's really, even in his time and then in later times, is most remembered for his Adirondack photography. And he took 10,000 pictures anyway of the Adirondacks, over 1,000 of Lake George alone. And Tim Widener, who's the executive director of the Chapman Museum, got a hold of me in 2016 and said, I'd like to do a book on Stoddard. Would you write the essay for it? And I thought, yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Thank you. So Tim's idea was a good one. He said, we'll focus on Lake George because it gives one area. There are absolutely gorgeous photographs of it by Stoddard, and it will let people have an introduction to his work that's not all, the Adirondacks is huge. It's the size of Vermont or New Hampshire. And so I liked his idea. So we worked on it together for a year. The book is a hardbound, softbound coffee table book with about 150 photographs, some reproductions of his painted works, engravings, maps. Stoddard was he was a genius. I'm going to use that word, although it's so abused today, but his photography is exceptional. He was forgotten not long after his death. He was virtually unknown. And then he got rediscovered in the late 1970s, and he's continually being rediscovered by scholars and us ordinary people who just love to see a beautiful picture. And the photographs of Lake George in this are stunning.
And you had actually mentioned that, Seneca Ray Stoddard, after he passed away, was forgotten, but then rediscovered. And he's right up there with the photography greats of the 19th century, like the Matthew Brady's and the Timothy O'Sullivans, et cetera, et cetera. He was one of the biggies in his time, wasn't he?
He's huge. He is today, to give you an example, they did an exhibition about luminist works, paintings, and photography in Washington. And it was called American Light. The exhibition was done in the National Gallery. Stoddard had his own wall. He had one wall that was dedicated to him. So he was right there with Carlton Watkins and William Henry Jackson and all the greats.
That's terrific.
But it's so often that we don't know kind of living near the Statue of Liberty. The people who live a mile away never go there.
Yep.
So Stoddard's kind of like our Statue of Liberty. We don't know enough about him or appreciate him enough. So I'm hoping that book, Water and Light, will get people out, take a look at him.
Absolutely. I find him fascinating. I've been to the Chapman Historical Museum, and I know Tim Widener, and I first became familiar with Tim through the Leadership Adirondack course through the Adirondack Regional Chamber of Commerce, and we had a tour of the museum, and that's where I learned all about Seneca Ray Stoddard, and you're right. What an amazing man.
Yeah, it's such fun. I mean, when we were doing the book, the one thing I said to Tim was, I said, as we march along the lake, we decided to go south to north. I said, for the benefit of somebody in California who doesn't know anything about Stoddard or Lake George or anything, you say, I think big. This is going to have great sales out in California. I said, we should try to get people oriented to where they are. Mm-hmm. Not pinpoint things. So we broke the book up that way into sections and used one of Stoddard's own maps to illustrate each part of the lake. And it gives a nice break, a nice breath, if you will.
I like that. That's very cool. Now, I had mentioned you've done a whole bunch of different things, and I wish we had more time to talk about everything, but I like to ask my guests what they have coming next. Now, at the beginning of the program, we talked about that mouthful of a name of that we decided to shorten to Over My Shoulder, which had a much longer title than that, and that it was part one of the compilation. So I guess if I were a betting man, should I guess that perhaps something on the docket for you is volume 2 of Over My Shoulder?
You see, you do have Saratoga blood in you. You know, you were betting.
Yes.
Making that bet, and you win. Volume 2 will come out next year, and there'll be a Volume 3 after that because there are just that many.
Oh, that's great.
It's fun, and there'll be in future ones too. There'll be more Saratoga history.
Yeah.
As I got going, would write about that. My daughter even lived and worked in Saratoga at one point, and it was so much fun to just reminisce and think about our time there. On another show, we'll have to talk, if you will, about Skidmore and when my grandmother, my father's mom, worked as a house mother at Skidmore.
Oh.
From 1949 to 1960. And I have artifacts and memorabilia of hers and memories stuck in my head, which I think could make a fun show. We could get some other people together, but I didn't mean to get off onto that.
No, that's great. I'd love to hear about everything you're working on. Now, when you sent me your bio, there was something I wasn't aware of. I had earlier expressed my love for The Burning of the Piping Rock. Apparently, you've completed a screenplay for it? Tell me about that.
Yes, I have.
Tell me more.
Oh, well, when I wrote it, I actually, as I write, I see what I write. So it's almost like I describe in words what's in my head. And I was living in Middletown at the time I was working on the book and commuting up on weekends back here to home and to Sarah. And I would come up, and as I was using the trope of the protagonist using a tape machine, mm-hmm. I suddenly realized that as he spoke, maybe I better find out if I had too many words for, one part of the drive and too few words for another, if you know. Because he's supposed to be remembering at one point going down Route 9. And I suddenly realized that I didn't have what was necessary. So I began to create areas where they would stop so that it could fit. I could fit in there what I needed to of his dialogue.
Sure.
And as I did that, I suddenly realized that I was seeing everything that was going on. So later, I just stripped out the dialogue and plugged it into a screenplay.
Neat.
And I'm hoping that somebody will be listening to your show, and when it's broadcast all over the world, and will say, hey, a nice film noir based in Saratoga Springs.
Well, Steven Spielberg is a very big fan of this program, so maybe he'll turn it into a movie. What do you think about that? I'm kidding. I'm sure he's never heard of me.
From your lips to Spielberg's ears, right? Yeah.
Oh, we'll figure out a way to get this to him.
one other thing I'll say quickly.
Yes.
The third character in the novel, because there's my father, the protagonist, there's Harry the Torch, but the third character is that 1951 Studebaker commander. And I have hunted high and low to find one because I'm going to try to film a trailer using part of the screenplay, just like a 2-minute trailer.
Oh, that'd be great.
So, yeah, 51 Studebaker commander with that bullet nose.
All right, and so any of you listeners out there, if you don't have a connection to Steven Spielberg, but do have a connection to that car, please let us know. I'll get Joe the information, and we can shoot that trailer. Oh, I hope it comes to fruition. That would be so fun to see it on the screen.
It would, absolutely. We'd have to premiere it in Saratoga Springs.
Absolutely, and I, of course, would hope to be invited to the red carpet premiere, right? No, actually, I want to be in it. It's been my dream to have a cameo appearance in either a TV show or a movie, so I would hope for a small part.
Consider it done.
All right.
I'll make you the bartender in the Brown Log Inn, which is now McGregor's on Route 9.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, cool. I could do that.
There's so much in that novel that's really real. And people say, well, what parts? And I said, well, I'll let you guess.
Right.
But there's a lot of real history.
Yeah, it's a blast to read. Okay, so we've been teasing that, the Seneca Ray Stoddard book and all the other things. How can people find these books, find out and learn more about you, Joe? It's time to give yourself a plug.
Okay. Well, I have a blog, which I also call a website, but it's called Burning of the Piping Rock. If you just Google the Burning of the Piping Rock, you can come up to that website, or you can Google my name, Cutshall-King. But just put in pipingrock.wordpress.com, and it will come right up. Yeah.
Beautiful. And you have a Facebook page for the book too, don't you?
I do. I have a Facebook page for it. So again, The Burning of the Piping Rock, and if you Google that, you should be able to come up and find it both on Facebook there. For those of you on LinkedIn, what else? Tumblr, Twister.
You have an Amazon author page, right?
I have an Amazon author page, absolutely. And that can give you the different books I've worked on. Histories and mysteries, as I tell people that I write. I have another mystery in me right now, which is I'm pouring out into the laptop. And I also have another history that I'm working on. And that has to do with Saratoga, but I'm not going to say any more.
Oh, come on. I want to scoop.
I can't.
Come on.
You will. You will when I get a little bit further down. I'm seeing if this time, I want to see who I can find to publish it.
Okay.
Nobody has done a book on this topic, not to be too mysterious, but...
Wait a minute, I think we talked about this before. I think I know where you're going with this, but I won't let on. I won't spoil the surprise.
And so I'm really hopeful that this was, I'll do it one way or the other, but I really think that this would be a dynamite topic, and Saratogans will be, I think they'll be happy that it's going to be coming along. And that's all I'm going to say. Okay, I won't make you say any more. You're a good man. No, you're a good man, and I'm so fortunate to have you on the show today. We go way back, and it's always a pleasure to talk to you. So, of course, when I started this podcast, I was thinking, well, I don't want to just have TV and movie stars. You know, it'd be great to have Robert De Niro on the show, but there are some local celebrities, authors and comedians and so on and so forth. I'd love to have them on, and I immediately thought, I've got to get Joe Cutshall-King on this show. So when I ran into you at the Chronicle Book Fair and asked you to be on the show, and you were so enthusiastic, I said, this is going to work, and it's been so fun talking to you, Joe. Oh, it has been I've had a ball. Thank you, Phil. Anytime. We'll have to do this again. Absolutely. As I said, we've only really touched the surface of everything that you've worked on. We could talk many more times. So, yes, I will have an open invitation for you to come back anytime you'd like. Okay. Take good care. Stay well. And you. I'd like to thank today's guest, Joe Cutshall-King. Joe, whether your dad did or didn't sell Scotch tape and cellophane to Harry the Torch to burn down the Piping Rock Casino may forever be a mystery. But one thing is for certain. He fathered a son who is quite a talented, accomplished, and fascinating gentleman. Continued best wishes, old friend.
Watching television,
We hope you've had a dynamite time listening to this edition of Phil's Pop Culture Podcast. Join us again next time for another stroll down memory lane. Until then, let's be careful out there.
Watching television, watching television. Watching television, watching television. Hey, I'm coming over, we won't have to